My self-made father kicked me out, calling me a parasite while I was secretly paying his bills. A month later, his empire of lies collapsed, and he showed up at my new apartment begging for a place to sleep. I looked him in the eye and said, "Sorry, this parasite is all booked up." I was 19 years old when my father finally found the word he'd been searching for to describe me. Parasite. My name is Caleb, and at the time, my entire existence felt like a blurred loop of fluorescent lights and heavy lifting. I had just finished an 11-hour shift at a grocery warehouse, a place that smells permanently of industrial coolant, damp cardboard, and the slow decay of frozen produce. I was dead on my feet, my muscles screaming with a dull, throbbing ache that felt bone deep. Every step I took in my heavy steel-toed boots felt like I was dragging lead weights through sand. I remember the sound of the garage door slamming shut behind me. It didn't sound like a house welcoming a son home. It sounded like a cell door locking me in. The air in the kitchen was thick with the tension you could practically taste. My dad was there, standing over the kitchen counter with a spread of bills laid out like a battle map. The moment I walked in, he didn't look up with a hello or even a grunt of acknowledgement. Instead, he waited until I was halfway across the linoleum before he flicked his eyes toward me. The expression on his face wasn't just anger, it was pure, unadulterated disgust. The kind of look you give a stray dog that just tracked mud across a white rug. "Of course you're home already," he muttered, his voice dripping with a casual venom that caught me off guard. "You always slither back here like you've got nowhere better to be. Like you're just waiting for the next handout." It was a Tuesday. I remember that vividly because I was staring down the barrel of 2 more back-to-back warehouse shifts and a midterm paper for the one college class I was desperately clinging to. I wasn't the kind of kid who took things personally. I'd grown a thick skin over the years, but something about the word slither got stuck in my chest. It felt oily. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just walked to the fridge, my throat parched, and reached for a bottle of water. He scoffed loudly, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed off the cabinets. "You ever think about pitching in for groceries, Caleb? Or do you just assume the food magically manifests in the crisper drawer?" He barked, his voice rising in that jagged way it did when he was looking for a fight. Then, with a twisted smirk, he corrected himself. "Oh, wait, you do pitch in? You eat it. That's your contribution, isn't it?" Consuming. 1,000 retorts flooded my brain, pressing against the back of my teeth. I wanted to scream that I covered my own phone bill, that I handed him rent money every time I had a spare $50, and that I worked 30 hours a week while carrying a full school load. I wanted to remind him that I did my own laundry, cleaned the house when he was too busy drinking, and didn't spend my weekends getting wasted or arrested like my older brother Ryan used to do before he finally burned every bridge we had. But I stayed quiet. Silence was my survival mechanism. In our house, Dad talked, and the rest of us simply fell in line, holding our breath until the storm passed. My mom, Jill, was in the living room, hovering in that gray space between existence and invisibility. She was pretending to read a book, her glasses perched perfectly on the bridge of her nose, but I could see from the hallway that she hadn't flipped a single page in 10 minutes. She sat there like a marble statue, frozen in the hope that if she didn't move or speak, his gaze wouldn't turn on her. It was her signature move, disappear into the furniture. I didn't blame her. 20 years of his moods would break anyone. But that day, her silence felt different. It didn't feel like she was neglecting me anymore. It felt like she was terrified for me. Dad started pacing the kitchen, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. "You're going to be 20 in a few months, Caleb. 20. Do you have any idea where I was at 20? I wasn't mooching off my parents. I was working full-time, paying real rent, planning a future. I wasn't hanging around, pretending to be exhausted because I had to lift a few cereal boxes. You have no drive, no spine." I wanted to point out that those cereal boxes were currently paying for the Netflix account he used every single night, but my jaw remained locked. Then he stopped pacing. He looked up at the ceiling, not even granting me the dignity of eye contact, and said it. "You're a parasite." 3 words, sharp, cold, and delivered with the casual indifference of someone commenting on the weather. He said it like it was a scientific fact, a biological classification I had finally earned. Parasite. It didn't even sound like an English word at first. I had to repeat it in the back of my mind just to process the syllables. He wasn't drunk, and he wasn't screaming in the red-faced, vein-popping way people imagine when they hear about abusive fathers. He was calm. He was icy. And that was the part that shattered me. He genuinely believed it. I stood there, paralyzed, as the fridge door hung open behind me. The heavy, cold air spilled out, swirling around my ankles and seeping into my socks. I was still wearing those steel-toed boots. They were scuffed, covered in dust, and smelled faintly of warehouse sweat and industrial glue. I had bought them myself, paying them off in installments because I couldn't afford the $100 up front. He took a step closer, invading my space. "You think you've got it rough? Please. You sleep under this roof, you use our electricity, you drink our water. And for what? Some pathetic entry-level paycheck and a D- in creative writing?" "I got a B+," I muttered, finally finding a tiny fractured piece of my voice. "What?" he snapped, leaning in. I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "I got a B+ in creative writing." He blinked, the information seemingly failing to register in his brain. Then he let out a short, wet snort of derision and turned away. "Even worse," he hissed. "A B+ in a useless degree for a useless career. Just another way to stay attached to the host, right?" I looked toward the living room, desperate for a glance or a nod from my mother. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes glued to that same unread page, her knuckles white as she gripped the cover. She stayed quiet, waiting for the moment to pass. But as I stood there in the cold draft of the refrigerator, I realized the moment wasn't going to pass. This wasn't just a bad Tuesday. This was the beginning of the end. The following week, the temperature didn't just drop outside. It plummeted within the four walls of our house. The atmosphere turned frigid, both literally and figuratively. My father, in his calculated indifference, started forgetting to refill the heating oil. It was late October, and the biting autumn chill was already seeping through the floorboards of our cramped two-story home, turning every room into a walk-in freezer by midnight. I could see my own breath misting in the air of my bedroom. When I finally approached him, shivering, and asked if I could at least run the small space heater I'd bought with my own warehouse money, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Get a second job, Caleb," he said, his voice as sharp as a razor blade. "Maybe then you'll actually earn the right to some warmth." I let out a dry, nervous laugh, genuinely convinced he was making a dark joke. He wasn't. When I lugged myself home from an exhausting double shift the next afternoon, my room felt hollow. My space heater was gone. My mini fridge, which I used to keep a few scraps of my own food separate from theirs, had been hauled away too. He had stripped my room of every minor comfort. He claimed they were a drain on the power bill, a burden he was no longer willing to shoulder for a house guest. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You want to keep luxuries like that? Get your own place and pay your own utility bill. Until then, stop sucking us dry." I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with a man like him was like shouting at a stone wall. It only makes your throat sore and changes nothing. If you pushed back, he simply crushed you harder. It was his kingdom, his rules, or the front door. So, I started disappearing. I volunteered for every closing shift the warehouse offered. I picked up grueling Saturday morning deliveries, hauling heavy crates through the sleet. I didn't do it because I loved the work. I did it because the warehouse was heated, and for 10 hours a day, nobody looked at me like I was a virus. Nobody called me a parasite while I was breaking my back for a paycheck. Then came the real kicker, the moment the floor truly fell out from under me. I came home late one night to find a small, battered cardboard box sitting directly in front of my bedroom door. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. Inside was a pathetic jumble of my life. Tangled USB cables, a bottle of cologne I rarely wore, and a few dog-eared paperback books I'd been meaning to finish. Taped to the top was a neon yellow sticky note with 3 words scribbled in his aggressive, slanted handwriting. "Start packing, now." Dinner that night was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Not a single word was exchanged. The only sounds were the aggressive scraping of stainless steel against porcelain and the occasional, sharp clink of a glass being set down too hard. My mother, Jill, poked at her salad with a focused intensity, as if the lettuce had personally offended her. She refused to meet my eyes. When I finally stood up to take my plate to the sink, my hands shaking slightly, Dad finally broke the silence. "You've got until the end of the week," he said, leaning back with a look of terrifyingly casual confidence. I froze, my back to him. The end of the week for what? To move out. To get your shadow out of my house. I didn't respond immediately. I turned around and just stared at him, trying to find a trace of the father I remembered from my childhood. He just set down his fork and crossed his arms over his chest. "You're a man, aren't you? You want to live like one, walk around like you're tired from a real day's work? Fine, be a man. Go figure out how the world actually works without me subsidizing your existence." My mouth felt like it was full of ash. "You're actually kicking me out." "I'm inviting you to stop being a freeloader," he corrected, his voice rising with a mocking lilt. "You really think I'm a freeloader? After everything I've tried to contribute?" He raised his eyebrows in mock disbelief, as if the very question was an insult to his intelligence. "I don't think it, Caleb. I know it. And frankly, I'm tired of looking at you." That was it. No screaming match, no cinematic explosion of glass. Just a cold, final sentence that severed our relationship. I looked at my mother, waiting, praying for her to say something, to offer a defense, a protest, even a sigh. But she just stood up, gathered her things, and walked to the sink as if I were already a ghost. That night, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering what I had done to deserve this level of vitriol. I wasn't perfect, but I was a good kid. I didn't do drugs. I didn't party. I stayed out of trouble. And I followed every arbitrary rule they set. Somehow, being the quiet, reliable son had made me the enemy. I realized then that he resented me because I gave him nothing real to criticize. My older brother Ryan was a walking disaster. He'd dropped out of college, totaled 2 cars, and crawled back home twice in a haze of debt and excuses. Yet Dad treated Ryan like a returning war hero every time he stepped through the door. I was the disappointment because I was a mirror he didn't want to look into. He had to invent reasons to hate me, so he labeled me a parasite to justify his own cruelty. Wait until you hear what happens next. But before we get to the most insane part of the story, make sure to subscribe to Reddit Echo and hit the bell icon. You don't want to miss the updates on this one. Let's get back to it. The rest of the week passed in a blur of numbness. I packed my life into trash bags and stored what I could in my beat-up car. I found a cramped, drafty room to rent above a retired couple's garage 10 miles away. It was small. It smelled like old motor oil and cedar, but it had a door with a lock and a silence I could finally trust. On the day I left, he didn't lift a finger. He didn't help with a single box. He just stood in the frame of the front door, arms crossed over his chest, watching me struggle. "About time," he muttered as I lugged the final bag past him. I didn't hug my mom goodbye. She didn't offer. She just gave me a fleeting, unreadable look, a mix of pity and relief that haunted me for weeks. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought I was finally free of the toxicity, but I was wrong. Exactly 1 month later, the script flipped entirely. The man who threw me out with a smirk, the man who called me a parasite, ended up standing on my new doorstep, shaking and begging for help. But before I tell you about that, you need to understand what was actually happening in that house while I was gone. Because the truth, the real, ugly truth, didn't just crack the foundation of our family. It blew the entire house down. For the first 2 weeks, I heard nothing. No calls, no checking in, not even the passive-aggressive memes my mom used to spam my inbox with every Sunday. I expected the cold shoulder, but the absolute crushing silence. It still stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. After all those years, I spent playing the part of the good kid, the one who never missed a curfew and always kept his grades up. I harbored this tiny, pathetic shred of hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd check in. I imagined a text asking if I'd landed on my feet, or a quick call to see if I was eating anything other than sleep for dinner. But nope. Total radio silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your eardrums. My new sanctuary was a single-room setup perched above a detached garage owned by a retired couple, the Landons. They were sweet in that classic, slightly nosy but well-meaning way that only people with too much time on their hands can be. Mrs. Landon was a creature of habit, baking loaves of banana bread every Tuesday like clockwork, the sweet singed scent of cinnamon drifting up through my floorboards. Mr. Landon spent the better part of his golden years in the shed, meticulously organizing jars of screws by size and thread count. They didn't have kids of their own, which probably explained why they treated me like a long-lost grandson. They were constantly hovering with offers of extra wool blankets, sturdy secondhand furniture, and even a dusty slow cooker they claimed they never got around to using. At first, my pride flared up. It felt awkward, almost shameful to accept charity from strangers when my own flesh and blood had tossed me out like a bag of expired trash. But when you've been exiled by your father and your diet consists of 25-cent ramen packets, a warm, slow-cooked beef stew tastes a hell of a lot better than pride ever could. So I swallowed my ego, said thank you, and I kept saying it. I threw myself into my work, pulling double shifts at the warehouse until my joints felt like they were filled with broken glass, slowly hoarding every cent. I made the executive decision to drop my one college class for the semester. It felt like the only logical move. I could barely scrape together enough for gas, let alone $300 textbooks. I told myself I'd go back when things stabilized, but in the dark of night, I wondered if stable was even a word that applied to my life anymore. Every night before I collapsed into bed, I did the one thing I knew I shouldn't. I checked my phone. It was a masochistic habit. I'd scroll to my messages, staring at the empty space under my mom's name, hoping for a crumb of acknowledgement. Just a hope you're okay, or stay warm, or even a missed call. Anything to prove I hadn't been erased. I was alone, branded a villain, and living in a garage. And the worst part? The storm was only just beginning to brew back at that house. Then, the poison reached my workplace. A coworker pulled me aside near the loading docks, her eyes darting around with that uncomfortable, pitying look people give to those they think are beyond saving. She told me she'd heard from someone at our local church that my family had been forced to sever ties for their own safety. It wasn't just a petty lie anymore. It was a full-blown, systematic smear campaign. I wasn't just moving on. I was being systematically erased from the social fabric of my own life. The pressure cooker finally boiled over when I ran into Ryan. It was late November, barely a week before Thanksgiving, and the sky was a bruised, heavy gray. I was finishing a grueling grocery delivery run near our old neighborhood, a place that now felt like a foreign country, when I stopped for gas. There he was at the adjacent pump, looking like he'd stepped straight out of a catalog. Designer quilted jacket, hair gelled into a perfect, immovable wave, and those obnoxious, expensive sunglasses, even though there wasn't a hint of sun. He was leaning against his gleaming black SUV, radiating an aura of unearned arrogance, practically waiting for a paparazzi crew to acknowledge his existence. He spotted me and let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh, his lips curling into a punchable half-smile. Well, if it isn't the ghost of Christmas past. Baby bro, I thought you'd skipped town or disappeared into the abyss. I kept my voice flat, my hands gripping the gas nozzle until my knuckles turned white. Just working, Ryan. He looked over at my beat-up, rusted Civic, then back at his SUV, the silent comparison hanging in the air like smog. Living the dream, huh? I didn't rise to the bait. I just gave a stiff nod. Something like that. Then he leaned closer, his eyes glinting with a cruel sort of curiosity behind those lenses. So, real talk. How's the anger management going? You found a therapist who can handle that explosive energy yet? I blinked, genuinely confused for a split second. What the hell are you talking about? He laughed again, a sound devoid of any real warmth. Come on, man. Dad told us the whole story, said you finally snapped. Told me you went full psycho and threw a heavy lamp at Mom's head. Said he had to physically restrain you. Is that true? Did you actually try to take her out? My jaw clenched so hard I felt a dull ache radiate into my temples. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He told you? He told you I attacked Mom? Yeah, man. He said he was genuinely terrified for her life. Said it was the last straw moment where he had to choose her safety over your drama. The air felt thin, like I was drowning in the middle of a gas station parking lot. I couldn't breathe. And you actually believed that? You've lived with me for 18 years, Ryan. You believed him? Ryan just shrugged, a casual, dismissive movement of his shoulders. Well, you always did have that quiet, brooding temper, Caleb. Everyone knows the quiet ones are the ones who eventually go postal. That was the spark. I stepped forward, not enough to hit him, but enough to make him flinch and lose that smug posture. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice trembling with a cold, focused rage. You've known me your entire life. You've never seen me throw a punch. You've never seen me break a plate. You've never even heard me raise my voice to Mom. But you hear one convenient lie from a man who manipulates everyone for sport, and you just sell your soul to the narrative? You're a coward, Ryan. For a fraction of a second, I saw it, a flicker of genuine doubt behind his sunglasses. But then the mask slid back on. He rolled his shoulders, scoffed, and looked away. Look, man, I'm just saying, if the whole family is scared of you, there's probably a reason. Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? I didn't waste another breath. I got into my car and drove away, my hands shaking so violently on the steering wheel that I had to pull over 2 blocks away. That was the moment of total clarity. I wasn't just being pushed out of a house. I was being actively replaced in the family lore. The following Sunday, I made the masochistic mistake of checking Facebook. I'd mostly stayed off social media to protect my sanity, but a dark impulse compelled me to look. And there it was, right at the top of my feed. A photo my mother had posted that morning. Their living room was already staged for an early Thanksgiving. The massive oak table was overflowing with food. Candles were flickering with a golden glow, and a cozy fire crackled in the hearth. And there sat Ryan, draped in his designer gear, lounging in my old chair at the head of the table. The caption read, "Grateful for family. So lucky to have my boys back together where they belong." My boys. As if I were a plural entity that had been trimmed down to a singular, better version. I wasn't even tagged. I was a non-person. The comment section was a graveyard of betrayal. "Such a beautiful family," one aunt wrote. "So handsome. So glad things are better now," another family friend chimed in. "You deserve peace, Jill." Peace. I stared at that word until it blurred into a white smear on the screen. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was a hurricane of every sacrifice I'd ever made for them, every shift I worked so they didn't have to worry, every insult I swallowed to keep the house quiet, every time I'd played the mediator. And this was the reward. They hadn't just evicted me. They had scrubbed the house of my existence like I was a stain on the carpet. The final straw arrived a week later in the form of a phone call from an unknown number. I answered it with a heavy heart. "Hello?" There was a long, jagged silence, then a whisper. "Caleb, it's your mother." Her voice was a wreck, thin and shaking. I sat down in the driver's seat of my car, my pulse beginning to race. "What's going on, Mom?" She began to sob, the sound muffled and frantic. "He found them. He found the texts I sent you. He took my phone. He went through everything. He said I betrayed the family. He said I was a traitor." I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. "Did he hurt you? Tell me right now, did he touch you?" No, not like that," she sniffed. He screamed. For hours. Said I was disloyal, that I'd chosen a lying, violent brat over my real family. He's beside himself, Caleb. I took a long, slow breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "You did choose him, Mom. You chose his lies over your own son." The silence on the other end was deafening. It stretched out for what felt like an eternity before she whispered, I know I did." Another pause, and then she delivered the words that finally snapped the last thread of my restraint. "He's moving Ryan into your room today." He said Ryan is the only son worth having. He's throwing out your old sketches and the books you left behind. He's making it Ryan's office. My room, my sanctuary, my desk where I spent nights writing, the books I'd saved up for, the walls that held the photos I never got back. Everything I had left behind was being gutted and handed over to the golden child. That was it. That was the breaking point. The grief I had been carrying for weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard diamond of resolve. At that exact moment, I stopped mourning the loss of my family and I started planning their downfall. I didn't know the how or the when yet, but something inside me turned to stone. If they wanted me to be the villain in their story, fine. I would be the best villain they'd ever seen. I wasn't going to fade away quietly into the night. They thought I was a parasite? They had no idea. Because my father had secrets, ugly, dark skeletons buried deep in his financial closet, and I was the only one who knew where the keys were hidden. It was time to stop being the good son and start being the consequence he never saw coming. And I knew exactly where he buried them. You see, people love to say that when you hit rock bottom, the only way to go is up. They never mention that rock bottom has a trapdoor, and if you aren't careful, the floor will drop out from under you all over again. I learned that on a bleak, gray Tuesday, when the last thread of my stability snapped. I lost my job. It wasn't some grand, cinematic confrontation with shouting and slammed doors. It was a quiet, clinical conversation in my manager's cramped office, where the air smelled like stale coffee and old printer ink. My manager, a woman who usually had a kind word for everyone, couldn't even meet my eyes. She spent the entire time staring at her own hands, wringing them nervously as if she were the one being sentenced. She spoke in those soft, hushed tones people reserve for putting down a sick dog. "Budget cuts, Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the warehouse fans. "Corporate is slashing all part-time hours across the board. I fought for you, I really did. You're a hard worker." "Is that right?" I asked. My voice felt hollow, like it was coming from someone else. I knew she was lying about fighting for me, but I didn't have the energy to call her out. "It's okay. I get it." I packed my locker in a silence so heavy it felt physical. No one offered to help. A few of my coworkers gave me that awkward, half-pitying nod as I walked toward the exit. That classic look of better you than me, disguised as politeness. Just like that, the only lifeline I had left, the only thing keeping me from total ruin, was gone. When I got back to my drafty little studio above the Landon's garage, I didn't break down. I didn't scream at the heavens or punch a wall. I just sat on the edge of my twin mattress with my work jacket still on, staring at the peeling wallpaper. I sat there for hours, wondering what cosmic debt I was paying off. What had I done that was so unforgivable that the universe decided to strip me of everything? The Landons knocked on my door later that evening. They'd seen my car in the driveway all day and were naturally worried. I forced a weak practice smile and told them I was fine. Just a bit of a bug going around. They probably didn't believe me, but they were kind enough to let me keep my dignity. The next morning, I opened my banking app. I stared at the numbers until my eyes burned, hoping they'd magically rearrange themselves if I blinked hard enough. Total balance, $132.47. My rent was due in exactly 11 days. That was the trapdoor opening. And that's when something strange happened. I laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a broken, wheezing, "You've got to be kidding me" kind of laugh that bubbled up from a place so deep inside me I'd forgotten it existed. Because honestly, what else was left? I had no money, no job, and a family that had branded me a violent criminal. I was 19 years old, scraping the bottom of a cold soup can with a fork because I didn't even own a proper set of spoons. But in that absolute isolation, a weird sense of peace washed over me. For the first time in my life, nobody was watching. There was no one left to impress, no one left to disappoint. There was no father looming over me with his cold judgment, no brother smirking at my failures, and no mother wringing her hands while telling me to just keep the peace. It was just me. And while it should have been terrifying, it felt like the first breath of real air I'd taken in years. I didn't sleep that night. My brain became a pinball machine, thoughts ricocheting off each other at 1,000 miles per hour. Panic, plans, regrets, and memories all collided in the dark. I kept thinking about every time I'd stayed quiet when I should have roared. All the energy I'd wasted trying to earn the approval of people who only ever viewed me as a burden or a parasite. I'd clipped away pieces of my own soul for years just to fit into the narrow box they'd built for me at NC. And my reward? A cardboard box of junk and a reputation as a monster. Somewhere around 3 a.m., the hardening began. I made a silent vow to the empty room. If no one else was going to believe in me, I'd do it myself. Step 1 was pure survival. I went into war mode. I hit every local job board, refreshing them until my thumbs ached. I applied for everything. Restaurants, gas stations, late-night cleaning crews, anything with a pulse and a paycheck. I walked miles into town, handing out paper resumes to shops that weren't even hiring. I applied for roles I was wildly underqualified for, fueled by a desperate kind of audacity. I even tried selling my old gear online, but the world doesn't have much demand for a used backpack with a broken strap or a laptop that sounds like a jet engine taking off. I started taking every odd gig I could find. I helped Mr. Landon with the heavy yard work he could no longer manage. I signed up for sketchy delivery apps, driving people to the airport at 4 a.m. I spent hours in strangers' living rooms, assembling complicated IKEA furniture for people who couldn't tell a cam lock from a wooden dowel. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting and often demeaning, but the money started to trickle in. $40 here, $25 there. It was enough to keep the wolf from the door. One morning, while helping Mr. Landon clear out his cluttered shed, I found a cache of old computer parts. I offered to refurbish and sell them online for him. He just shrugged and told me to go for it. I managed to get $180 for the lot. When I tried to hand him $100 for his share, he pushed my hand away with a gentle smile. "Put it toward your rent, Caleb," he said. "Call it your commission for the hard work." I stood there completely speechless. No one had ever done something like that for me. Not without strings attached, not without a lecture on how much I owed them. That night, Mrs. Landon left a heavy bag of groceries outside my door. No note, no fanfare, just pure, unadulterated kindness. I ended up crying into my pillow that night, the first real tears I'd shed since leaving home, because the compassion of strangers hurt more than my father's hatred. Weeks bled into months. December rolled in, bitter and sharp, turning the world into a landscape of ice and iron. I spent my mornings shoveling driveways until my hands were blistered and numb. Anything to keep the momentum going. I was surviving. I was building a life out of the scraps they threw away. But while I was out there in the cold, earning my keep, the perfect family back at the house was starting to rot from the inside out. My father's secrets were beginning to claw their way to the surface, and soon he'd realize that the parasite he discarded was the only thing that had been holding his fragile world together. I managed to scrape together some seasonal work at a local garden center, where I spent 10 hours a day stringing tangled holiday lights and hauling oversized wreaths for minimum wage. New Year's Eve was a masterpiece of pathetic isolation. Just me, a soggy microwave burrito, and a pixelated YouTube countdown playing on my cracked phone screen, but I was still standing. Barely, but standing. And that was when the universe finally decided to stop throwing punches and started offering a hand. People began to notice me. Not the family that had discarded me, or the friends who had ghosted me based on a lie, but real people. There was this one regular at the garden center, a woman named Carla in her late 30s with a sharp, discerning eye. She came in 3 times in 2 weeks, specifically asking for me to help her figure out a complex patio lighting layout. I was just being myself. Friendly, patient, offering a few tips on how to hide the wires and create depth. "You ever consider learning digital design?" she asked casually as I rung her up. "You've got a natural eye for layout, Caleb. You think spatially and you understand balance. That's rare in someone your age." I shrugged, feeling that familiar old spark of insecurity. "I used to like writing. I thought about graphic stuff once, but..." She didn't let me finish. She just slid her business card across the counter. "I'm an interior designer. You should try it. Seriously, you're wasted hauling mulch. I tossed that card into my glove box and forgot about it for a week. But on a particularly cold Tuesday, I pulled it out. I borrowed an ancient, clunky Chromebook from the Landons and started devouring free tutorials online. Graphic design, typography, color theory, grid systems. I became a ghost, haunting the internet until 4 a.m. every night. I downloaded every open source tool I could find and tinkered until my eyes bled. I joined design forums and posted my first logo attempt, only to get absolutely roasted by the pros. But one guy messaged me privately. "Your instincts are solid. Don't let the jerks get to you, just keep going." So I did. I became obsessed. I redesigned logos for non-existent tech companies, made poster mock-ups for indie movies that didn't exist, and created Instagram ad campaigns for imaginary streetwear brands. Within 2 months, I had a small, scrappy portfolio. One night, on a total whim, I posted a "will work for cheap" ad on a freelance site. 7 days later, a small coffee shop in Ohio bit. They needed a new menu design. They paid me $75. I sat in my tiny room and almost cried over that $75. It was the first time in my life I'd been paid for my mind, not just my muscle. I used half that money to buy better software. The next gig paid $150, then $300. I was still delivering groceries and cleaning the Landon's gutters, but the internal shift was seismic. I had a skill. I had proof. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't a parasite. I was a creator. Then came the day that changed the trajectory of my life. A mid-sized startup reached out. They needed a full brand kit. It was a massive project, far bigger than anything I'd ever touched. My imposter syndrome screamed at me to decline, but I whispered yes instead. I spent 2 weeks living on caffeine and adrenaline, obsessing over every single pixel. I drafted, redrafted, and then redrafted the redrafts. When I finally hit send, I was a nervous wreck. The client replied within the hour. "This is perfect. We love the direction. Sending payment now." They paid me $850. I stared at that number on the screen for a full minute, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could do this. I was doing this. By the end of March, I had 4 recurring clients. One of them even sent me a $200 holiday bonus just for being reliable and easy to work with. The irony was delicious. I was being rewarded for the very traits my father claimed I lacked. I started living like a human being again. I bought a proper winter coat, shoes that didn't let the slush in, and I finally replaced my shattered phone screen. I even got my old laptop repaired. And then I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I enrolled in community college again. But this time, there were no creative writing classes to please my father. I was taking design and business. I was doing it for me. It's funny how you can rebuild a life in plain sight while the people who broke you remain completely oblivious. My parents didn't notice my first client. They didn't see my 5-star ratings. They didn't know I was now an independent contractor paying my own taxes. But they were about to notice something else entirely. Because while I was quietly climbing out of the pit, their perfect house was crumbling into it. One spring afternoon, just as I was finishing a brand presentation for a new tech client, there was a knock on my door. Not a text, not a call, but a heavy, desperate knock. When I opened it, I had to blink twice. I thought it was a hallucination. It was my father. But he didn't look like the man who had thrown me out. He looked like someone had reached into his chest and ripped his soul out through his throat. His tie was crooked, his expensive shirt was wrinkled, and his hair was significantly grayer than I remembered. He looked old. He looked defeated. And for the first time in my life, he looked me in the eye, not with disgust, but with a terrifying, hollow desperation. His voice, when he finally dared to speak, cracked right in the middle like a rotted floorboard under too much weight. It was a sound I'd never heard from him, a sound of structural failure. "Caleb," he rasped, his eyes darting to the floor, then to the peeling paint of my door frame, anywhere but my face. Can we talk? Just for a minute?" I didn't offer a chair. I didn't offer a hello. I didn't even move. I just leaned against the frame, crossing my arms, letting the silence stretch out until it became an interrogation of its own. He swallowed hard. his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat that looked far too thin for his collar. I need a place to stay, just for a little while, just until I get things sorted. And in that moment, the entire puzzle clicked into place. The radio silence from my mother, the cryptic texts, the sudden disappearance of those happy family Facebook posts, it all came rushing back. The perfect house of lies, the one he had built with such meticulous cruelty, had finally collapsed into the dirt. And now the man who had discarded me like a piece of industrial waste was standing on my doorstep, shivering in the spring breeze, begging for a way in. I looked him up and down. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heart. A heart that didn't belong to him anymore. With a voice that was calm, steady, and devoid of the old tremors of fear, I spoke. "Sorry," I said, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. "This parasite's all booked up." But that wasn't the end of it. Because what he had done, what they had both done, was 1,000 times worse than I'd realized, and soon the rest of the rot came spilling out, piece by ugly, jagged piece. He didn't leave immediately after I delivered that line. He just stood there on my porch, his knees seemingly locked in place as if he'd forgotten how to walk. For a split second, I expected the old version of him to flare up. The red-faced tantrum, the booming voice that used to make the walls shake when things didn't go his way. But that man was gone. He just stared at me with a hollow, vacant expression, like he was looking at a total stranger. And honestly, good. Because I wasn't the same kid he'd tossed out 4 months ago. I wasn't the quiet, obedient son who bit his tongue until it bled. I wasn't the invisible roommate or the family scapegoat who carried the weight of everyone else's dysfunction just to keep the fragile peace. I was my own person now, and I had something he'd clearly lost: peace of mind. I waited a few more seconds. He still didn't move. So I slowly closed the door, not slamming it, because that would imply I still felt enough anger to care. I just eased it shut, like I was putting an old, boring book back on a shelf where it belonged. Then I turned the lock. He didn't knock again. I stood there for a full minute, my hands braced against the wood, my heart pounding like I'd just finished a marathon. It wasn't adrenaline from a fight. It was the sheer, intoxicating power of the reversal. The man who swore I was dead weight, the man who told my entire extended family that I was a violent lunatic who attacked my own mother, was out in the cold while I was inside, warm and safe in a life I'd built without a single cent of his help. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul that he'd stolen years ago, but the high was short-lived. As I lay awake that night, the darkness of my studio felt heavier than usual. Questions started clawing at the back of my skull. Why me? Why now? What had happened to the golden boy Ryan? And where was my mother? I hadn't heard a peep from her since that panicked call. I didn't go for the throat immediately. I'm not impulsive. I've spent too many years watching his moves to play my hand too early. If I was going to hold them accountable, I needed information. I needed leverage. So I started with recon. I reached out to my cousin Jordan, the one who had ghosted me the hardest. I sent a single clinical message. "Hey, I know what you were told. It was a lie. If you ever want to hear the actual truth, I'm here." To my absolute shock, she replied within the hour. "I'm so sorry, Caleb. I didn't know what to believe. Your dad made it sound like you'd completely lost it, that you were dangerous. But then I heard what actually happened from Aunt Jill." My blood turned to ice. "Wait, Jill's talking?" "Yeah, she left him." 2 words that hit like a thunderclap. My mother had actually left him. She'd vanished quietly a few weeks ago, going to stay with a friend across town. No posts, no announcements, just a clean break. Jordan explained that Mom had finally broken down and confessed the whole sordid story to her sisters. The real story. How Dad had been emotionally abusive for decades, twisting facts and fabricating crises just to keep everyone under his thumb. How he had weaponized his sons against each other and forced her to choose between her husband's ego or her son's survival. Jordan's final message was a gut punch. "She regrets it, Caleb, more than you know. She's not the person she was when you lived there. The house is empty and your dad has nothing left." I sat in the dark, my phone glowing in my hand. The parasite was gone, and the host had finally realized he was the one who had been hollow all along. But there was still one question. If the house was empty, where was Ryan? I didn't know how to respond to the news of my mother leaving. My mind was a chaotic mess of conflicting impulses, each one pulling me in a different direction like a game of emotional tug-of-war. Part of me wanted to call her immediately, my voice cracking as I demanded the apology I had been owed for years. Part of me wanted to scream until my throat was raw, letting out every ounce of bitterness I'd bottled up since that night in the kitchen. And yet, another part of me, the part that still remembered her reading to me as a kid, just wanted to drive across town and hug her, hoping that the warmth could melt the ice between us. But above all else, I needed to understand the why. I needed to know what had finally caused the pillar of our household to crumble. So, I started digging. I reached out to an old family friend, Mrs. Randall. She was the kind of woman who had babysat Ryan and me for years, a sharp-eyed observer who always saw right through my father's practiced charm and charismatic veneer. "Oh, honey," she sighed when she picked up the phone, her voice thick with a mixture of pity and relief. "I've been waiting for you to call. I knew you'd want the truth." She laid it all out for me, and it was a spectacular slow-motion train wreck. The perfect house of cards hadn't just fallen, it had disintegrated. As I suspected, Ryan had moved into my old room the second I was gone, but the change of scenery hadn't changed his character one bit. He was the same entitled, lethargic soul he'd always been. He blew through his entire savings in 2 months, quit his job in a fit of pique because a manager had the audacity to disrespect him, and turned my childhood home into a frat house, throwing ragers every weekend. My mom had tried to rein him in, but Dad? He did the opposite. He leaned into the favoritism, feeding Ryan's ego, handing him wads of cash, and manufacturing endless excuses for his behavior. It was the golden child treatment on steroids. That was until the day my mother opened the mail and found a foreclosure warning. It turned out that while Dad was busy calling me a parasite, he was the one bleeding the family dry. He'd taken out a massive loan behind Mom's back, a desperate high-stakes gamble to help Ryan start a business. But Ryan didn't build a business. He built a fantasy. He poured $40,000 into crypto scams, sports betting, and high-end bottle service at clubs he couldn't afford. 40 grand, gone in the blink of an eye. When Mom finally confronted them, the explosion was seismic. She finally saw the full ugly scope of what she'd been enabling. The weaponized loyalty, the toxic favoritism, and the mountain of lies my father had used to keep her in line. For the first time in 20 years, she didn't retreat into the shadows. She packed a bag and walked out. Mrs. Randall's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. He never expected her to leave, Caleb. He thought she was a permanent fixture of the house, like the walls. That's why he's unraveling. He's lost his audience, his enabler, and his home all at once. That explained why he was at my door, looking like a hollowed-out shell. But it didn't explain the secret I was holding. A secret I'd stumbled upon purely by accident a year before I was kicked out. Back then, Dad had been struggling with some tax forms on his laptop and asked me to print them. When I plugged in the flash drive he'd handed me, I found a folder buried deep in the directory named Archive. Inside was a digital graveyard of PDFs, spreadsheets, and scanned bank records. At the time, I was the good son, so I didn't think much of it. I copied what he needed and moved on. But out of some inexplicable survivalist instinct, I saved a copy of that folder to my own private drive. I hadn't looked at it until now. What I found made my jaw drop so hard it felt like it hit the floor. It was all there. Financial records stretching back years, showing a web of bank transfers and credit card accounts I never knew existed. There was a PayPal account under a fake name, linked to large withdrawals and thousands of dollars being funneled into an offshore account. Then, I found the smoking gun. An email chain between my father and someone named N. Jacobs, discussing cash reimbursements and the necessity of keeping certain paperwork off the books. It took me hours to piece the puzzle together, but the final picture made my stomach churn with a cold, greasy nausea. My father hadn't just been frugal. He'd been siphoning money from his old employer for years, It wasn't quite embezzlement in the traditional sense, but it was close enough to land him in a federal courtroom. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling with the weight of the discovery. This wasn't just a petty family squabble anymore. This was leverage. This was the nuclear option. But I didn't press send. I'm not impulsive, I'm a strategist. I started planning. I created multiple backups on encrypted drives, printed the most damning documents, and locked them away in a physical folder. I even reached out to an old contact who worked in corporate compliance, posing a hypothetical scenario. His advice was chillingly clear. If you have proof of internal fraud or tax avoidance, you have options. But if you go nuclear, be prepared for the fallout. It will destroy everything he has left. The plan began to crystallize in my mind. I didn't want to just destroy him. At least not yet. I wanted him to experience the exact flavor of hell he'd put me through. I wanted him to feel the crushing weight of disbelief, the suffocating grip of powerlessness, and the freezing cold of isolation. I wanted to wait until he was at his absolute lowest, stripped of his ego and his lies, and then I would offer him a choice: truth or exposure, redemption or total ruin. It didn't matter how many people he'd convinced that I was the problem. It didn't matter how many stories he'd spun to paint me as a threat or a parasite. I held the receipts, literally. And when the time was right, I was going to collect. But first, I needed to understand exactly where my mother stood in this wreckage. Was she a victim of the fallout, or was she still an architect of the silence? I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen, and sent a text that felt like a bridge built of glass. We should talk. Just once. I don't want anything from you. No money, no favors, just the truth. She replied within minutes, as if she'd been sitting there with the phone in her hand, waiting for a haunting to begin. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. That little park by the lake. Bring a jacket. It's cold. I stared at the glowing text, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Tomorrow. After months of being a ghost in my own family, I was finally going to stand face to face with the woman who had watched me be exiled. I needed to know if she was finally ready to step out from behind his suffocating shadow, or if she was still sheltering there. Either way, I was ready. I wasn't that scared, shivering kid in the warehouse boots anymore. I was a man with a roadmap of his secrets, and I was just getting started. The next afternoon, the air was a biting, sharp cold that seemed to sting my lungs with every breath. The park by the lake was desolate, the only soundtrack being the mournful whistle of the wind through skeletal bare branches and the rhythmic, dull splash of gray water against the muddy bank. I saw her before she saw me. She was perched on a weathered bench near the pier, wrapped in a tan wool coat I didn't recognize, something she must have bought since the split. Her hair was shorter now, cropped in a way that revealed more of her face, and it was heavily streaked with gray. She looked smaller somehow. Not frail exactly, but deflated, like a balloon that had slowly leaked all its air over 20 years. When she finally noticed me approaching, a small, tentative smile flickered across her face, though it died long before it reached her tired eyes. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. It was the first time I'd heard that word in nearly a year, and it felt like a physical weight landing on my chest. I sat down beside her, making sure to keep a polite, intentional distance. We both stared out at the choppy water for a long time, the silence stretching between us, heavy and thick, but surprisingly not hostile. Finally, she broke it with a whisper. "You look good, Caleb. Healthy." "I'm doing better," I replied, my voice steady. "Actually better." "I can tell," she said, rubbing her hands together to keep warm. I heard you're working now. Doing digital design?" "Yeah, freelancing. I've been building a solid roster of steady clients lately." She nodded, a faint, genuine smile appearing. "I'm proud of you." The words landed strangely. They were soft, but they carried the echoing hollow of all the months she hadn't been there to say them. I didn't let the sentimentality distract me. I took a breath and looked her in the eye. "Why did you lie, Mom? Why did you let him say those things about me?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I didn't mean to. I panicked, Caleb. He made it sound like it was an ultimatum. Him or you." And for so long, I was brainwashed into thinking that keeping the peace meant keeping him happy and me miserable. I thought if I stayed quiet, the storm would just blow over like it always did. Tears began to well up in her eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. I know now. I know how wrong I was. You didn't deserve a second of it. I was a coward. I already knew she was a coward, but hearing her admit it, stripped of excuses, stripped of the "he's your father" rhetoric, hit me harder than I expected. She continued, her voice trembling. After you left, the house changed. He got worse, more aggressive, more controlling. He'd sit in his armchair every night, drinking and rambling about how ungrateful the world was, how everyone was out to get him. Then the money trouble started. I found the notices from the bank hidden in the junk drawer. Foreclosure warnings. When I finally confronted him, he looked me in the eye and lied. Said it was under control, that he was just repositioning investments. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Turns out he was just losing everything. And when I told him I couldn't do it anymore, that I was leaving, he told me I could go, but I wouldn't take a single penny with me. So I packed my bags that night and walked out into the dark. She turned to me, her gaze desperate. He's lost it all, Caleb. The house is officially on the market. The bank is repossessing the cars. He even got fired last week. Apparently, they did a surprise audit at his office. I blinked, the final piece of the puzzle locking into place. They caught him. Her eyes widened slightly, searching mine. Caught him? You knew? I hesitated, then decided the time for secrets was over. I told her everything, the archive folder on the flash drive, the offshore transfers, the shady emails with N. Jacobs, the years of quiet siphoning. As I spoke, she just stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. When I finished, she let out a long, shuddering breath. So that's why you looked so calm when he showed up at your door begging, she whispered. Yeah, I said, looking back at the lake. I already knew his empire was built on matchsticks and gasoline. I was just waiting for someone to drop a light. She covered her mouth with her hand, her head shaking in disbelief. You could have gone to the police, Caleb. You could have ended him months ago. I could have, I admitted. But I didn't want to see him in a cell. I wanted something else. I wanted him to understand exactly what helplessness feels like. I wanted him to have to sit in the ruins of the life he built by stepping on everyone else. Her eyes softened and she reached for my hand. You've already won, honey. You're free of him. Maybe, I said, but I still need closure. The real kind. I looked at her, the plan finally fully formed. I need your help with one last thing. 2 days later, I pulled up to my parents' house. The for sale sign was already hammered into the front lawn, leaning at a crooked, pathetic angle against the wind. The house itself looked smaller, grayer, as if it sensed it was about to be abandoned by the people who had made it a prison. Dad opened the door before I could even raise my hand to knock. For a fleeting second, his face lit up, maybe with relief, maybe with the delusional hope that I was there to save him. But the moment he saw the cold, clinical expression on my face, that light vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged edge of defensiveness. What do you want? He asked, his voice sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. I came to talk, I said, stepping toward the threshold. And this time, you're going to listen. You've destroyed me, he finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the empty house. No, I said, standing up to my full height. You destroyed yourself. I just stopped cleaning up the mess you made. He didn't answer. He just stared past me, his eyes unfocused and glazed, as if he were watching the final credits roll on a life he thought was untouchable. I walked to the door, stopping only to look back one last time. The company will be calling you at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Cooperate, Dad. For once in your life, do the right thing. I left him there, sitting alone in the dark of his empty house, the same way he'd left me. The fallout was a Category 5 hurricane. Within a week, the audit expanded into a full-scale forensic investigation. His personal accounts were frozen by the feds. His former boss, the man he used to brag about golfing with as if they were equals, filed a formal criminal complaint. When the local paper ran a piece about financial discrepancies at the firm, the small-town rumor mill went into overdrive. For years, he'd been the pillar of the community, the self-made provider, the proud father of the golden child. Now, people crossed the street to avoid him. Some of the very relatives who had blocked me reached out with groveling apologies for believing his smear campaign. Ryan, predictably, vanished the second the well ran dry. He moved in with some business partner 2 towns over. Last I heard, he was trying to pivot into selling alpha mindset entrepreneurship courses to teenagers on TikTok. Mom started over too. She got a steady job at the local library, a quiet place for a quiet woman. She rented a small, sunlit apartment and slowly began to rediscover who she was when she wasn't hiding from a predator. We meet for coffee every Sunday. It isn't perfect. There are too many ghosts sitting at the table with us, too many years of silence to bridge. But it's a start. And me? My freelance business exploded. The client I'd designed that startup logo for was so impressed with my tenacity that they recommended me to a major marketing firm. Within months, I was juggling enough high-ticket projects to move out of the garage and into a sleek, modern studio downtown. The first night in my new place, I sat on the hardwood floor eating takeout Thai food, watching the city lights shimmer through my one clean floor-to-ceiling window. I thought about the years of being belittled. I thought about the parasite label. And then I thought about the way my father looked as I walked out of that house. He didn't look like a villain anymore. He didn't even look like a father. He just looked small. I realized then that I didn't need revenge anymore. I'd already won the only war that mattered. I had survived him. Months later, a letter arrived. The envelope was cheap, and the handwriting was a shaky, hesitant cursive I barely recognized. Caleb, I confessed, to all of it. They're letting me repay the debt over the next 10 years. I'm working a part-time retail job now, staying in a spare room with an old coworker. I know you don't owe me a single thing, but I wanted to tell you. I was wrong about you. About everything. You're not a parasite, Caleb. You're the only one of us who actually learned how to live. Dad. I read it once, folded it carefully, and slid it into the back of a desk drawer. I didn't do it out of bitterness, but because I didn't need to reply. The silence wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a boundary. I'd said everything that mattered the day I closed his door. I stepped out onto my balcony that evening, breathing in the cool, crisp spring air. Below me, the city hummed with a restless, indifferent energy. For the first time in my life, I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't trying to prove my worth to a man who was never worth my time. I had built a life from the ashes, one honest, hard-earned piece at a time. I leaned against the railing and whispered into the night, the words finally feeling real. I'm free. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for my channel. Your support means everything. See you in the next one.